Vice-Chancellor at this great annual occasion of the Vice-Chancellor's public debate. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kulin Nations, so the Wurundjeri and the Boomerang tribes, who were the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders present. Welcome and thank you. So this is an exciting annual event, and it's probably one of the last public events that will be held in this building for Monash alumni and students. The rotunda is to come down. Great for sadness, I know, but will be replaced by a wonderful performing arts space. And we have the magnificent learning and teaching building coming up next door, which will show you a whole new way of learning. So the Vice-Chancellor, in fact successive Vice-Chancellors over the last decade or more, have been sponsors of the Monash Association of Debaters. And it's obviously a group that we're extremely proud as a university to support, because the values of debaters, of bringing together argument, information and informing opinions and the community, is a value that we hold extremely highly as a university. The Monash Association of Debaters is truly a world-leading society. Didn't win the title this year, but is the only institution to become World Debating Champions for 3 consecutive glory years, from 2010 to 2012. So if any of those debaters are here, give yourself a clap. And this public debate draws people externally and our most distinguished internal student debaters to debate topical issues of the time. Now, tonight's topic, which should come up with that clicker, did when you did it. Oh, I'm going to ask you to come and do that. Always embarrassing when an academic can't get a slider. So tonight's topic is that we support the Fair Works Commission decision to reduce penalty rates. Okay, so a topical and highly contested issue, and I'm sure we're going to hear highly nuanced arguments on both sides of the debate tonight. For the affirmative team, we have Mr. Innes Wilkes, CEO of the Australian Industry Group, Mr. Scott Barkham, Director of Workplace Relations at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Mr. Aaron Lane, Legal Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome. On the negative side, we have Ms. Susie Allison, Assistant Secretary for the National Union of Workers, Mr. Julian Hill, Member for Bruce in the Australian House of Representatives, and Miss Amy Gilbertson, Member of the Monash Association of Debaters, and really one of the most sparkling stars, I've been told. So, we're going to have a very interesting debate. Each speaker will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. I might get you to make it before the slides, because I'll get it wrong again. We're going to commence with the affirmative with Mr. Scott Barkham. He leads, as I said, the Australian Chamber's Workplace Relations Policy team, working to ensure, you're going to be able to read this a lot quicker than I
was going to say, don't go through the whole thing.
No, but you know, he's important. He's worked with mines and metals, and the Chamber actively represents Australian employers at the global level, including in the International Labour Organisation. So, at the completion of the debate, we will open to questions. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you. I'm a bit frightened by the dirty great photo, but we'll get through. Susan, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Julian, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to the Monash Association of Debaters for bringing this evening, particularly from our side of the room, some of those closest to the recent changes to penalty rates and those best placed to separate facts from fictions before you this evening. I'm in love with my new gadget, so I'm going to get it to give me a timer. My friend Ines Willetts' organisation and my member organisations representing shops, restaurants, fast food, chemists ran the penalty rates case, and I want to start tonight by telling you why. I'm sure penalty rates are very important to many of you here tonight. I spent my uni years working in a bottle shop, and Sundays were the best day to work, no question. But wage costs on Sundays and public holidays also have wider impacts on small business people and their families, on those seeking jobs and those wanting more hours, and on all of us in the community wanting to shop, eat out, go to the pub and get a prescription filled on the weekend. Tonight is an opportunity to deal in facts. Not misinformation, not exaggeration, but facts on the changes that are being made to penalty rates for Sunday and public holiday work, as I said, in shops, pubs, restaurants and pharmacies. But first I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Penalty rates are higher minimum wages for working on particular days or at particular times. Relevantly for our conversation tonight, for Sundays and public holidays. They're contained in awards set by the Fair Work Commission, and they're expressed as multiples of ordinary time wages. So you'll hear us talk about time and a half, double time and a half. And a major decision was handed down in February this year to moderately reduce Sunday and public holiday penalty rates in 4 retail and hospitality industry awards. So why, as employers, did we run this case? Why did we apply to moderately reduce some penalty rates in these 2 industries? Why did we invest our money, our time and our political capital to secure change in this area? Technically, the case was triggered by an award review process under Rudd government legislation, and by the consolidation of 1,400 awards into 122. But that's not the reason. We ran this case because our members were increasingly telling us that penalty rates were damaging their businesses and their capacity to stay in business, to be competitive and to continue to employ people in their communities. And we ran this case to allow us to create more jobs, offer more hours and provide more services. This wasn't ideological. It was a pressing and growing concern from the people we represent that Sunday and holiday labour costs were out of balance and had become damaging. I could go through some of the evidence, but our motivation for running the case is better illustrated with an example. Dairy Bell. Dairy Bell was an ice cream company based in Camperdown here in Victoria. It had been running for 42 years. Its ice cream was popular, even well loved, but it closed down in 2015. There are many reasons why any business closes down, but the former co-owners of Dairy Bell were very clear that penalty rates were one of them. At the time they shut, they said, "We tried our own shops with terrific customer response. However, the weekend trade, our best time, made losses due to the high weekend cost of labour in our stores." So we had a company with a product people wanted. They sought to adapt to changing circumstances by retailing as well as manufacturing. Customers were buying their ice cream on the weekends, but the costs of labour made the business unviable. It closed and their staff lost their jobs. As I said, not balanced, not sustainable, and had to change. There's only so much people are willing to pay for an ice cream, for a coffee, for a burger, for a beer. You'll be familiar with weekend and holiday surcharges, which only some businesses can put on. But employers know they cannot inflate the cost of their products by 2.5 times as penalty rates are. They can't inflate the price of what they sell on a Sunday to the same extent their wages are inflated. And they can't pass those costs on to customers that won't pay. The invidious choice our members face is either not trading on Sundays or holidays, where they even have that option, because a lot of employers must open. They either do that, they trade at a loss, or the proprietor works themselves, or they understaff. In those businesses that do trade, I often notice dirty tables, long queues, and delays in getting drinks and food. This is the visible impact of chronic understaffing due to excessive penalty rates. Look out for it. Now I've mentioned it to you, you'll start to see it too. Some of you here might actually be the poor bunnies working in chronically understaffed situations. I can assure you that most of your employers would like to put on more staff around you, but often they just cannot afford to do so. You may also, and I've just seriously got to apologise because this was a great example until, Susan, you had a problem with the IT. So please, this is not about you. You may also notice the odd flustered person who's a bit older in a shop, clearly struggling to juggle their customers while working the register. That's the owner or the franchisee, forced to work themselves rather than offering jobs to a younger person because they just can't afford it. We ran this case particularly for smaller business people and their families, most exposed to the impact of prohibitive and damaging penalty rates. It's these smaller and family-owned businesses that will increasingly now be able to offer jobs and more hours as moderate penalty rate changes are phased in. I'm proud to say that we collectively, Innes's organisation and the ones I represent, ran one of the most professional and well-evidenced cases to ever become before the Fair Work Commission in its 113-year history. We secured changes to penalty rates not only because we were right, but because we invested in bringing the best possible evidence we could. And as my friends will tell you, this was an extensively evidenced and very strongly evidenced case. I mentioned at the start the need to stick to facts in assessing these penalty rate changes. So what are some of these key facts? Firstly, penalty rates are not being abolished. Employees will still receive considerable additional pay for working on Sundays and holidays. Sundays are still going to be the highest paid day to work in any ordinary week. Looking internationally, Australian employees will still be paid much more for working on Sundays, or at least as much for working on Sundays, as any other employees in the world. So that was absolute confidence. Our employees will receive additional payments for work on weekends, the equal of or better, after this decision as anywhere in the world. Penalty rates are not being slashed, this amazing verb that seems to apply to any changes in wages. Rather, moderate reductions are being phased in over 3 to 4 years. The Commission didn't accept what Innes's organisation and my organisation told them about how to introduce these things. It did so more slowly. Those currently working in pubs and restaurants and shops generally will change jobs during this transition time, and they'll change rosters. Those of you here that might be pulling beers or waiting tables are likely to have entered your career jobs before the full penalty rate changes are made. And across the next 3 to 4 years, minimum wage rates are going to go up, almost certainly by more than prices, offsetting, at least in part, any losses for Sunday shifts. And we know that when the expert panel that sets minimum wages, when it does its work across the next 4 years, it's going to have a mind to the penalty rate changes and working out how much it wants to award. We also say that employees working on Sundays and holidays are going to continue to receive a more than fair wage for doing so. Let's assume it is 2020, and after the 4-year phasing in and 2.5% or so wage increases each year, a 21-year-old casual shop assistant is still going to earn more than $287 a day. On a holiday, more than $410. To put these wages in context, a relief teacher in Victoria currently earns just $293 a day, or by 2020 about $311. Just quickly, these penalty rate changes are not at large. They are applying only shops, pubs, restaurants, pharmacies. There is no wider conspiracy in our organisations to change all penalty rates. It's untrue and irresponsible to suggest so. Nurses, ambulance drivers, the person driving the 630 bus up North Road here on a Sunday, the librarian at your Monash library, their rates are not changing. And an at-large proposition to say we're changing rates across the economy is not right. The numbers are also exaggerated. You'll hear people say 700,000 people are losing penalty rates. No one's losing penalty rates. 700,000 people are having them cut. No, actually that number's more like 217,000 as independent fact-checking has confirmed. The losses to individual employees are also being vastly exaggerated. And there is widespread reporting and claims based on the worst possible contrived losses for pharmacists working alone in charge of a pharmacy who work every Sunday and only on Sundays. That's not honestly reflective of the outcomes of this case. Ladies and gentlemen, my time's getting pretty close to being through. In Australia, we work to resolve complicated industrial relations issues, often emotional industrial relations issues, through balance and through facts. That's what the Commission did in this penalty rates case, one of the largest and most well evidenced in its history. We ran this case to reinsert balance into this area of our industrial relations system that had become unbalanced. We ran the case for those who employ on Sundays and holidays in retail and hospitality, and we ran the case for those who want to employ more people. We ran it for those in work, and we ran it for those who want jobs and who want more hours. And we ran this case for the communities in which we all live, communities that are stronger, more vibrant and more cohesive, for people being able to shop, eat out and have a drink on weekends. We also ran it for those people to be able to be able to have a coffee that doesn't cost $8 and not pay $12 for a beer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Next speaker, as the only person fumbled, the next speaker is Julian Hill, elected as member for Bruce in the Australian Parliament in July 2016. Bruce is in the Dandenong area and has the most culturally diverse population of any of the Victorian electorates. He's Deputy Chair of the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit and a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. For those students in the room, he was elected a councillor at Port Phillip Council at the age of 25 and subsequently became the youngest ever mayor of the city in 2000. He is a proud, I hope, Monash alum with degrees in science and law and a postgraduate qualification in international relations and is a fellow for the Institute of Public Administration Australia. Thank you very much, Julian.
So everyone, I never did debating at uni, so this is a kind of form of karma or catharsis, I'm not sure which. But it was actually in this building. I'm going to be sad when I walk past the campus and see it gone, that my mum first had to accept that I was not a Liberal. She saw me on television leading a protest against Jeff Kennett with a megaphone when we busted into this building. So anyway, it was an important family moment. Look, at the outset, we need to be clear on one thing. This is a wage cut. We can call it adjustments to penalty rates and whatever language we want to use. It is a wage cut, a wage cut, a wage cut. Now we can argue about the numbers. You say 300,000, we say 700,000. Most people I've seen in the newspaper say 600 to 700. Whatever the numbers are, it is a wage cut. It is also the thin end of the wedge, as we are seeing for many others, and I will make clear in a moment, millions of other people in Australia. We're not dealing with a blank sheet. We're not designing this on a whiteboard or the IPA's magical place in Canberra or wherever it is. We're dealing with reality, a society and an economy as we find it. In the real world, in families, communities, and particularly for young people and for women, for whom this wage cut will affect deeply. Now, it's not inevitable. I have to say that at the outset. We choose. We choose the kind of society we want. We choose the kind of economy we want. There is nothing inevitable about this unwanted and damaging change to long-established social and economic structures in Australia. I can find a coffee not for $12. I can find an ice cream not for $10 if we're dealing with numbers as we find them. I can find that any part of Melbourne. This goes to the heart of the kind of society we want and want to be, because labour is not a normal input. It's not electricity, it's not rent, it's a human being. And ethical and human concerns have to be taken into account when we're talking about the relationship between employers and workplace relations. Now, the Australian community has long valued people working unsociable hours. We've long had different rates for nights, for Saturdays, and yes, for Sundays. People miss family events, they miss time with kids, they miss being able to have a night out because they have to get to work early the next morning on Sundays. My daughter's at uni and I know that very well. This stuff is also really important to the fabric of communities, that we allow some space in our social and economic structures where those gatherings, family and community events are prioritised, and that people are rewarded when they choose to give them up. Now, in my view, reducing penalty rates sets the tone. It reduces the necessary respect and the value of time that should exist between employers and employees, because it's a wage cut. We should be talking about other things like flexible work, the right to caring responsibilities, the right to part-time work, because I cared for my mum when she died and I was so lucky to have that industrial right for a year, worked part-time, that most Australians still do not have. But as a society, this sets the tone and we choose the kind of society and economy we want to create. We could choose to keep these arrangements. The economic arguments that we have to ditch them is somehow, roll over and take your medicine, it'll be okay, it's an ideology. The other thing we need to understand is for millions of Australian households, it's not just part-time students, for millions of Australian households, they rely on penalty rates to cover their everyday expenses, not added cash bonuses for executives. But in this case, this wage cut for up to 700,000 people means one of two things. Either people are forced to scramble for any extra hours that would be created just to maintain their take-home pay, that's reality, and many people with caring or studying responsibilities can't do that, or they face the loss of household income. Now that worsens inequality, as we will hear, and it particularly affects lower income workers. And importantly, affected workers spend every dollar of their pay. I'm a high income earner. People like me who just got a tax cut in the current government, we have discretionary income. We can choose to save, we can choose to go on overseas holidays. The people bearing the brunt of these impacts do not do those things. They spend every dollar in the real economy. Now, in terms of the economic impact, cutting wages is not an efficient way of boosting productivity or growth. It does the opposite. Reduced domestic spending reduces turnover in the economy and the sort of businesses that are cutting wages. The average figures that we have, independent evidence, is that an average of $3,500 a year will be reduced from full-time employees' wages. That's thousands of people with less money, thousands of dollars less in their pocket to spend. Now, I've looked at the decision. I don't believe there's any compelling evidence that cuts to low and middle income wages create more jobs and employment overall. The proponents of the wage cut, as handed down by the Fair Work Commission, argue a flawed version of the trickle-down myth, which goes something like this. Well, increased profits, therefore employment will magically increase because business will automatically employ more staff, because of course that's what they do, and they'll probably be open for longer hours. In fact, the Fair Work decision talks in passing about an increase in the aggregate hours. It doesn't talk about an overall enormous increase to employment rates for a few reasons. Because workers will be scrambling to get those hours, as I said, to maintain their take-home pay. Because larger businesses tend not to invest savings in more jobs. We've heard a few anecdotes, and I'm sure there will be businesses that can make that claim. But you can't make national policy by anecdotes based on the experience of some small businesses. Larger businesses, there's no evidence that they will employ more people with that money. They employ as many people as they need to do the job, no more, no less. And longer hours do not mean that consumers have more money in their pocket to spend. People can't spend money they don't have. The other 2 points I'd make in closing and establishing the frame for our argument are firstly timing. This is the worst possible time that you can imagine to cut wages, because wages in Australia have already stagnated for the last 5 years. We've had the 20th consecutive quarter of falling wages growth for private sector workers since mid-2012. Most recently, the growth rate of 1.9% is the lowest since 1991, and that's ABS statistics. And this consistent reduction in wage growth has resulted in real wages to remain stagnant for the last 4.5 years, and in some sectors and cases actually decline in real terms. Quite simply, starving workers' wages when they're already flatlining, despite company profits having shot up by 40% in the last year, shrinks the whole economy. We create a negative cycle where wages are depressed, we make the cost of living even harder for average everyday workers, we worsen inequality, as we will hear. That's bad for business and consumers when they spend less, and it also threatens budget projections for taxation revenue. The final thing I'll say, which is one of the most fundamental reasons why we cannot support this decision, despite some of the fair enough anecdotes, there will always be some businesses who make a case from this, and that is the precedent issue. It is absolutely untrue, the line we've heard from those opposite in press releases for months and months and months to say, oh, this only affects these workers, don't worry, it won't go anywhere else. We are already seeing other sectors and other industries line up in the Commission seeking to cut wages in their sectors. We've got the hairdressers who are refusing to rule it out. We've got an application before the Commission for the restaurant and catering industry. We were laughed at. We were told we were scaremongering months ago. This wouldn't happen. You're scaring people. But this is the true agenda. They may not admit it, but they can't rule it out. And of course this precedent establishes the measuring stick for other sectors. So we've already seen enterprise bargaining agreements say, oh, well, the wages are being cut, we have to lower the wages in EBAs. That's a fact. When you look at the reasons for this decision, these are applicable to other awards. The Commission said, well, this is a special case because of the existence of entry-level jobs. There's consumer expectations of weekend work and out-of-hours public holiday service. On balance, the disutility for employees in the wage cut doesn't prevent a reduction in penalty rates. It's not relevant that employees were earning just enough to cover their weekly expenses. They are the reasons the Commission gave, and they are directly translatable to any number of other sectors. That's what independent academic and legal advice tells us. The sectors most at risk: aged and healthcare, nursing, transport, security, cleaning, construction, clerical, laundry and dry cleaning, hair and beauty, teachers and education working on weekends, mining, social, community, disability, home care, nurseries. All of those sectors have expectations of 7-day a week. All of them have entry-level jobs. The very same factors apply, which are why the others are lining up with the Commission. The decision is wrong. It's made against a flawed legal framework. Whoever's in politics, whoever's in government at the time that these decisions come about, needs to deal with this reality. We never intended, when we put in place these laws, that they would enable across-the-board wage cuts for whole sectors. We did not intend that. And so I think a responsible Parliament has to deal and respond to these decisions and say, no, this cannot set a benchmark for millions of other workers in a time of stagnating and declining wages to cut wages further. So that's the guts of our argument, and I think there's a lot more that could be said, particularly on inequality and the actual impacts and the workplace impacts. So thank you.
Our second speaker for the affirmative is well experienced in this sort of forum. Aaron Lane is a legal fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, where he specialises in employment, industrial relations, regulation and workplace law. He's a lead author on the recent IPA research paper, Penalising Work, the historical account of penalty rates in Australia, and has appeared before numerous Senate committee inquiries, the Productivity Commission, the Fair Work Commission, courts and other tribunals. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that introduction, and to ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out tonight. It's great to be here at Monash University. I must admit, I've only ever visited the campus twice, and the most recent was for my wife's graduation a couple of months ago, so it is great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from the Debating Association. As Scott mentioned in his introductory remarks, the task, I think, for our side of the debate tonight is to separate out that fact from fiction. And before I do that, I just want to spend a few moments highlighting, I guess, some personal background that I bring to this debate tonight, because often in these sort of public forums and you enter the political fray, I mean, you've always got to have a thick skin when you enter the fire, but you do get accused of, not understanding what it's like and having no idea. And I do know what it's like. I paid my way through university. In my first year, I worked as a delivery driver for a large franchise for a pizza place. I was paid a per delivery rate. On a busy night, I might earn $10 an hour. But that was a really important job for me. I was really struggling. I got this job, and that allowed me to to go to the supermarket, to fill up the cupboards, to fill up the petrol tank and drive home. I lived a number of hours away from my parents, and that was a really important first entry into the workforce for me. And my next position was in the kitchen of a large fast food franchise, where I was paid around $12 an hour, which I thought was, to be honest, excellent at that time. And because again, it was that opportunity to support myself. And there were penalty rates that were applicable to us, although it was nights and weekends where everyone was free to work. Because we're all university students mostly, we were free to work those nights and weekends, and yet it was those shifts that were the hardest to come by. And many of us were forced into working during the week where it wasn't convenient for us to work at all. I worked as a freight delivery driver on the minimum wage, and unemployed men would come into the warehouse pretty much begging for work and offering to work less than the award wage, offering to work for cash just to get their foot into the labour force. So I know what it's like. I've seen the limitations of a highly centralised, highly regulated bargaining system that doesn't account for individual preferences. I've seen a system that distorts business decision making, and this hurts those that are most in need of work. And you know, to go to a point that Julian correctly made, these are human concerns. These are human concerns because there is dignity in work. But the focus when we're talking about anything to do with employment laws should be about creating the opportunities to get people into work. It should be getting those that don't have work at the moment into the workforce, because they are the most vulnerable people in society, those outside of the labour market. And so we want to bring down the barriers for people getting a job. And so that's certainly something that I'm passionate about, and something the IPA is passionate about, is promoting more opportunities for work. And the fact is that the Fair Work Commission found that this will unlock opportunities, that employment opportunities are being held back. And I think that's the point that's missing in a lot of the analysis about wages and take-home pay and those sorts of things. What's missing in that analysis is the scope for employment growth that the Fair Work Commission found. And these weren't just a couple of examples. These were not just a few little anecdotes, as has been put. The extent of the evidence was compelling. The Commission heard evidence that there was 143 lay and expert witnesses over 39 days worth of hearings. And if you have a look at the Fair Work Commission's reasons, there is example after example after example after example of businesses that either weren't opening, so that there was a hotel, for example, in Sydney that closed part of the area of the hotel, that were closing parts of the restaurant, were closing cafes on particular days, not because there wasn't the consumer demand there, but because of the cost structures in place. That they were rolling over work. If they didn't have to clean hotel rooms on the Sunday, they were holding them over, not employing people and making people do more on the Monday. This is distorting decision making. Other evidence presented that businesses were operating on a skeleton staff. Others, as Scott mentioned, were operating themselves rather than employing other people. And some were altogether closing on Sundays and public holidays. How can this be possibly sustainable in an economy where consumers want to go out on the weekend and be able to visit their favourite restaurants and cafes and pubs with their friends and family? On the other side, how is this possibly sustainable in an economy where students and young people prefer to work on weekends and public holidays because they have such different study commitments during the week? So, as I said, the evidence was overwhelming. This was not one anecdote. This was not made on feelings. It was made on facts. But of course, penalty rates are designed to prevent employment. This was the original reason for penalty rates being introduced, in order to penalise work. They were introduced in Victoria in the 1890s, and the intention was to prevent businesses from opening on Sundays. It was also, to be quite frank, done for racist reasons, in that they wanted to prevent the cheap labour from competing when it was a time where white Australians felt like they had to go to church on a Sunday. And so they were prevented from working where others could. So penalty rates have always been about blocking people from the workforce and deterring work. But something's changed, society's changed, and the Fair Work Commission found in their reasons that no longer are penalty rates about deterring work. And so the question that perhaps those opposite might like to answer is whether they want to continue prohibiting work. The Fair Work Commission applied the law. They applied the legal framework. They made a decision according to the law. And that law provides that when circumstances change, the penalty rates can change as well. And this is the framework that was set up under the previous Labor government, ably assisted by the union movement. This was a decision made by commissioners, all of which were appointed by Labor ministers Bill Shorten, Julia Gillard and Chris Evans. And the legislative proposals that the Labor and the Greens have put up in the Parliament seek to make this system worse. They seek to make it even more inflexible, even more centralised than it is now. And so what I think is that the campaign that we're seeing being run isn't about facts, it's about a partisan political agenda. And I think that's sad. But it's laid bare when unions such as the CFMEU threaten a big nationwide campaign against the federal government and hold rallies around the country despite not a single one of its members being affected by the decision. The partisan agenda is laid bare when a gentleman from Coles is standing behind Bill Shorten who is not affected by the Fair Work Commission's decision. It's laid bare in Victoria. We've got a parliamentary inquiry into penalty rates, despite the fact that Victoria hasn't had any powers on industrial relations since the mid-1990s. It's incredible. And it's laid bare when the Fair Work Commission have made similar decisions in 2010 and 2014. In 2010, there was a reduction in some awards when they were being merged in this award modernisation process. In 2014, we saw a moderate reduction for casual workers employed under the Restaurants Award. And somehow we're told in 2017 that this decision is radical. It must be opposed, it's somehow radical. What it really says is this actually is a wider trend. And when the circumstances change, when preferences change, the Commission is empowered under the current legislation to make a decision. And so the final point I'd make, I appreciate my time is running low. So the final point I'd make is that the other thing with this partisan political campaign is around the union's own deals with their EBAs that reduce penalty rates for weekend work. So, for example, how is it that a bed and breakfast must pay $10 an hour more than a 5-star hotel? How is it that a family takeaway shop must pay $8 more than KFC? How is it that a family greengrocer pays $5 more than Coles and Woolworths per hour? These deals have been agreed to by the union movement under the existing framework. So how can it be all of a sudden a national outrage when this decision is being made? So in my view, I think what we're seeing here, any opposition to the Fair Work Commission's decision, it's not based on facts, it's based on politics. And so thank you very much again for the invitation tonight, and I look forward to a few curly questions after the speeches have concluded.
Thank you very much. Aaron's mentioned the unions. I'd like to introduce the second speaker for the next. Susie is the Victorian Assistant Secretary of the National Union of Workers, one of Australia's largest unions, representing workers in the supermarket supply chain, food production and warehousing. She sits on the Southeast Asian Women's Committee of International Union of Food and a board member of the McCall Institute Victoria. She's led multiple campaigns fighting for job security, and prior to joining the National Union of Workers was an associate to Justice Marshall in the Federal Court of Australia. Susie.
Thank you. Thank you. When I was a student, I worked as a casual employee at a shop selling barbecue chicken. And like 40% of young people who work, I relied on penalty rates as part of my wage. I regularly worked Sundays. I also played basketball. And it happened that our grand final fell on a Sunday. Now I knew that if I attended the grand final and didn't go to work, I would lose my job. And I needed my job, so I chose to work. We lost the grand final because we didn't have enough players. The penalty rates that I received for working on a Sunday didn't compensate me for not playing in the grand final, and it certainly didn't compensate the rest of the team for the fact that we lost. But it was at least some recognition that I was giving up something important by working Sundays. And really, that's what penalty rates are all about. An inelegant and inaccurate way of trying to put an economic value on Sundays, Saturdays, and public holidays. The affirmative side says that really things have changed. That Sundays and public holidays and Saturdays, now that we live in a 24/7 society and we all want to shop all the time, doesn't really have the same value as it did back in the old days. They'll say that it's inevitable that Sundays will really become like Saturdays, will really ultimately become like any other day of the week. It's rubbish. It's not reflective of our current society, and it is certainly not reflective of the type of society that we should be aspiring to, where there should be more work-life balance, not less. For thousands of years, Sunday has been acknowledged as a day of rest. Now, you'll often hear the argument from the other side that Sunday penalty rates are a hangover of some bygone era when Australians all attended church regularly. But Australians haven't been attending church for 60 years regularly. In 1947, that was when the current structure of penalty rates came into play. In 1947, the majority of people didn't attend church regularly on a Sunday. The penalty rates for Sundays, first and foremost, were to recognise the day as being important as a day of rest, to compensate for those who had to work out and miss out on a day of rest. Now, in our increasingly frantic world, where employers would like us to be on call 24/7, when they would like to be able to send you an SMS at any time to ask you to start your shift, where they would like you to check your emails constantly, the concept of Sunday as a day of rest, recuperation, catching up, is perhaps more important than it has ever been before, and perhaps needs protection more than it ever has before. Sunday is the day that we spend with our family and friends. Time for yourself, time for mental health, time to sleep. A day off during the week is not the same as a Sunday, because if you have children, they're at school, and most of your family and friends are at work. So despite the hype around we're all a 24/7 society, our society continues to value Sunday. 75% of people don't work on Sundays, and 82% of people are in favour of us keeping the previous penalty rates or making them higher. And note this, because this is important. So while people like to go out to shops and restaurants on their Sundays and public holidays, this has not translated in them wanting to devalue Sunday and reduce penalty rates for those who work. This is a fundamental value of Australian society. So how on earth has the Fair Work Commission come out with a decision that cuts penalty rates on Sundays and public holidays? The decision not only flies in the face of the value that our society puts on Sundays and public holidays, it is also grossly unfair. Because, as Julian stated, when it gets down to it, when you take away the bells and whistles, simply put, this is about taking money away from some of the lowest paid workers in our society and transferring it to business. The decision affects 700,000 retail, hospitality, fast food workers directly, who are working on the award minimum wage. 700,000. That is huge. And as Julian stated, that's only the thin edge of the wedge. There's more to come. If you work in retail, hospitality or fast food, you don't earn much, The retail wage is 40% under the national average. The hospitality average wage is even lower at 50% of the national average. You are likely to be a woman, with 60% of Sunday workers in retail being women, and over 54% of women in hospitality working on Sundays. So the decision to cut penalty rates will actually increase the gender pay gap as well. As a worker in retail and hospitality, you are also more likely than other industries to have employers who rip you off and don't pay your wages already. So whether that's George Columbaris not paying overtime, 7-Eleven, Pizza Hut, and Aaron, I wondered whether that was maybe the company you were saying you were driving pizzas around for, or Baker's Delight. So these low-paid and often exploited workers now stand to lose up to $77 a week from cuts to Sunday penalty rates and up to $60 every public holiday. That is a very big hit for people who are already struggling to make ends meet. This decision transfers the costs of operating a business on a Sunday from the business owner to the backs of the people who are in the least position to wear that cost. And the decision also sends a very clear message. If you have to work in retail or hospitality or fast food, then your personal time, your Sundays or holidays are not as valued as much as the rest of society. Sunday is really important if you're buying the coffee. Sunday's not so important to you if you're serving it. The decision is just not fair. Now, those on the affirmative will say that this spectacularly unfair decision is justified on the grounds that it's for the greater good of society, and you've heard those arguments here tonight. In making this statement, they have confused the interests of business with the interests of Australian society as a whole. They say the decision will create more jobs. It won't. Even right-wing economists concede that the likely result is that current employees will just be asked to work additional hours to take home the same pay package. So, for example, if you work 8 hours at a cafe on a Sunday, you stand to lose about $40 in your take-home pay. Now, clearly $40 isn't enough to put on another worker. However, it is enough to ask that worker to stay behind for another 2 hours, to work an additional 2 hours so they can take home exactly the same pay packet at the end of the day. They say it will boost the economy, but on the contrary, as Julian has noted, the problem with our economy at the moment is not that there is a lack of opportunity for us to go out and spend our money at cafes and restaurants. The problem with our economy, rather, is the stagnation of wages and job insecurity, which makes people reluctant to spend. Taking money away from 700,000 workers in retail and hospitality is hardly going to be an incentive for workers to spend more money. I want to touch just briefly on a couple of the other arguments. The argument about the minimum wage somehow compensating workers for the penalty rate, that is a disingenuous argument. Now, the minimum wage hovers around what is widely accepted as the poverty line in Australia. It is adjusted every year to keep up with inflation. The minimum wage adjustment isn't to take into account cuts to conditions and penalty rates. The other disingenuous argument relates to enterprise bargaining agreements. As everyone on the affirmative would well know, that certainly in enterprise bargaining agreements where workers have power to bargain, they are able to bargain higher terms and conditions of employment that are above the award. And there is a test to make sure that their wages and conditions is above the award. So the fact that you might not have penalty rates for a Sunday in an agreement is because you've got higher wages and conditions, and so you don't need that. The problem with the cuts to the penalty rate is that actually undermines the safety net, so it will ultimately affect people on agreements as well. In closing, I want to say this. Behind this deeply unfair penalty rate decision is the flawed assumption that acting in the interest of business is acting in the interest of the wider Australian society. The decision is reflective of the neoliberal philosophy that has dominated politics in Australia for the last 30 years and has now resulted in us facing the type of inequality in Australia that we have not seen for 70 years. So we now have a situation where 1% of Australians earn more wealth than the bottom 70% of Australians combined. And while profit growth is the strongest it has been in 15 years, last year profit went up 40%, wages for workers have stagnated. Wage growth is the lowest on record. In other words, business have kept the profits for themselves and their shareholders. They have not shared it with the rest of the Australian society. This neoliberal philosophy and the decisions like that of the Fair Work Commission regarding penalty rates is not working for the Australian society. But we do have a choice. We need to call out decisions like the Fair Works Commission's decision. It's not a matter, as the affirmative suggests, of us sitting back and going, oh well, the Commission made an unfair decision, we should all just cop that. No, we have to call it out and we need to fight them and demand more of our leaders, demand an alternative vision that is not about a 24/7 society where people's needs, values and working rights come secondary to that of businesses. We need to change the rules. The trade union movement is at the forefront of that line, and if you would like to be in the campaign for change, I will be happy to recruit you after the debate.
Thank you very much, Susie, for that recruitment campaign. There we go. Ines Willis. As you can see, Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, which represents businesses in a broad range of sectors, including manufacturing, construction, transport, defence, ICT and labour hire. And you can see his current appointments and the commitment he makes to the community. Fascinating career, fascinating. He started as a journalist. Chief of Staff at The Age newspaper in Melbourne, Chief Political Correspondent for The Age in the Canberra Parliamentary Press Gallery. I'm sure there's many a story he could share. He was Australian Consul General to Los Angeles from 2006 to 8, representing a wide range of Australian interests in that dynamic hub of the west coast of the United States. Educated at Melbourne High School. You know, we only acknowledge the people who were educated at Monash. No one else. They were all just born with their careers. Melbourne High, Monash University, a BA in History and Politics, and Edinburgh Business School. Thank you, Ines.
It's an OHS issue. I was going to say, this is a really sad night for me because I hadn't realised that the rotunda was being pulled down. And I spent much of my misspent youth in these buildings. And maybe Julia and I can get together and storm Margaret Gardner's. How does that sound to you? Okay, thank you everyone. It's great to see you all. Thanks to Julia and Susie and Amy, and thanks to all of you for being here. And it's great that there's an interest in this issue, which is probably the third most talked about issue in the political debate at the moment after the plebiscite and after energy prices and energy costs. So you've got us on the third one. I'm happy to talk about the second one, maybe not so much on the first. That's still out of my ballpark. Hey, it's good to be here. There's a lot of misinformation around this debate, and that's why it's great to be here with Scott and Aaron to try to put some facts, some real information into this this debate and this discussion. I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, and we represented the interests of fast food industry in the Fair Work Commission's deliberations. So it's from that perspective that I'll talk to you today. Why are they called penalty rates? They're called penalty rates because they're penalising employers. As we said, that was the whole point, that's the whole intent. Penalty rates is to make it hard for business. That's why they were set out the way they were in the 1890s, that's why they've gone on through to this day. They're not called bonus rates, they're called penalty rates. They're penalising employers. And the key thing in the Fair Work Commission's judgment, after 39 days of evidence, thousands of submissions, an enormous amount of material that they consumed, was that they found that penalty rates were neither fair nor relevant in the sectors where they made that decision. Fast food, retail and hospitality. They didn't say that about nurses, they didn't say that about firemen or firewomen, they didn't say that about police officers, they didn't say that about aged care workers, they didn't say that about any of the other sectors that you've heard sort of being mentioned tonight as furphies. In fact, the President of the Commission, Ian Ross, made it very clear, and he said there is no precedent in this for other parts of the economy. In fact, to test that, the Commission has asked for a case to be held into another sector, into hairdressing sector. The argument's be run again, and we're going to run that argument, and that'll be a very difficult case because the Commission has already said there are no precedents to come out of this. Each industry needs to be taken on its merits and according to its circumstances. And what I want to do is explain why these sectors that we spoke about today, retail, hospitality and fast food, are different and do warrant different attention. Penalty rates are not being abolished. You hear that all the time. Penalty rates are being abolished. If they haven't been abolished, they've been slashed. Wrong. The Commission has phased in over 4 years some reductions in penalty rates. So they go from 150 to 125% of the daily rate over 4 years in the fast food sector. The first cut was 5% from 150 to 145. The sky hasn't fallen in. Very minor cut. Also, the Commission is very clear that these sectors are different. And why, after all the evidence, did it conclude that? Well, let me focus on fast food, the industry that we represented. The majority of fast food workers are full-time students, and the majority of them are aged between 15 and 19. 2/3 of the employees in the industry work less than 25 hours a week, and about 60% work on Saturdays and 60% work on Sundays. The Commission accepted on the detailed evidence that was provided, including surveys of tens of thousands of fast food workers, that a large proportion of them preferred to work in the evenings and on weekends rather than during regular business hours, and that many preferred to work on Sundays rather than Saturdays. This is because of personal factors, playing sport and the like on Saturdays. Rather, of not great concern to them was the quantum of the penalty rate, it being different from Sunday to Saturday. And that's what's happened here. The Sunday penalty rate is being phased down to equate to the Saturday penalty rate. It's not being abolished. In addition, the peak times in the fast food sector were very different to the rest of the economy. Another point of difference that the Commission made clear. Regular business hours have little relevance in the fast food industry. Most of it's done at night, early mornings, weekends. That's when the fast food sector is at its busiest. Another relevant issue is that up until the time when modern awards were introduced in 2010, 7 years ago, in 2010, many of the awards that applied in the fast food industry did not contain any weekend penalty rates at all. There were none. This is a new thing that came up in 2010. So this is not something that's been going on in this sector since 1826 or whenever. It's new. It's also relevant that a large proportion of fast food industry employees are covered by enterprise agreements. The large majority in fast food are covered by enterprise agreements. Those who are covered by enterprise agreements are not impacted by this decision at all. The penalty rates decision was made by 5 judges, all appointed by Labor governments, all heard evidence over 39 days, 143 witnesses and 6,000 submissions. And as I said, after all of that evidence, the Commission found that penalty rates were neither fair nor relevant in these sectors of the economy. Fairness cuts both ways. Don't think it doesn't. Fairness cuts both ways, and the Commission found that it was neither fair nor relevant. Now, there's a review going on at the moment into the decision. 2 unions have appealed, as they have the right to do, and as you would expect that they would do, and will be participating in that review. So, we heard today that the 3.3% minimum wage increase wasn't relevant in this. Suddenly, sort of a pay rise to everyone doesn't count. Every worker on a minimum wage got 3.3%. Think that through. There'll probably be another 3.3% next year, and the year after, and the year after. That will far outweigh these reductions in penalty rates. We heard today, how many times have we heard today 700,000 workers were affected? Well, the ABC, that paragon of independence, maybe someone I don't agree with all the time. It's a little bit like when I go on the ABC. It's like talking to my enemy so that I can talk to my friend, the ABC. But I do like the ABC because they do a great job. And in this case, they fundamentally fact-checked that Labor claim. ALP and the unions claim that 700,000 Australians would take a pay cut from July the 1st, just passed. The ABC found that that claim was fanciful. Completely wrong. Labor Party's introduced a bill into Parliament to overturn the Fair Work Commission's decision, so that an independent umpire can only make one decision, to give a free kick to one side and continue to penalise the other. The only decision they make is how much of a free kick that they give. This will be like employers, people who employ everyone in this room, having no say in the future of their workplace when it comes to wages. It will just be, well, you're either going to give a 5% pay increase or a 2% pay increase, whatever number they come up with. There's no point in arguing the circumstances of the time. So there's a lot of sensationalism around in this issue, and we've heard some of it tonight. This misinformation impacts all of you, young people. It impacts on your parents, on your grandparents, impacts on your relationship with employers, with the employer that you have, builds mistrust, puts into place an atmosphere of antagonism, and it damages the brands of businesses, and it deters investment, and it deters employment. And if businesses in fast food and retail decide that enterprise bargaining agreements become much too difficult to deal with, then businesses, their employees and the broader community will be worse off. And this is a significant risk. Now, let me just go into a little bit of detail, just for 1 second, because this is a clear misinformation that's spread around. In a number of recent articles, they compare the Sunday rate in enterprise agreements approved some years ago with the current Sunday rates in awards applicable to workers not covered by agreements. The articles then, on this basis, deem enterprise agreements in fast food and retail industries will be unfair if the rates in an agreement are lower than the current rates in the award. This approach is misleading and unfair and invalid for a couple of reasons. Firstly, many enterprise agreements in fast food and retail have what are called loaded rates that smooth the rates across the week, with the higher rates being paid on weekdays to compensate for the lower rates paid on weekends. Secondly, enterprise agreements in fast food and retail have been are assessed by the Commission at a time when they're made, and the Commission has determined that employees under the agreement are better off than if the relevant award had been applied. They're better off. Also, enterprise agreements typically include a whole range of other benefits for employees rather than wages, and these are taken into account when we're considering the better off over. Thirdly, when the modern award system was introduced in 2010, penalty rates substantially increased for many businesses in fast food and retail, and the higher rates were phased in between 2010 and 14. Many of the enterprise agreements in fast food were made before 2014. Therefore, the boot, as it's called, delightfully, the better off overall test, was assessed against the award penalty rates that applied under the phasing arrangements at that point of time when each agreement was approved. And fourthly, the boot requires that every single employee covered by an enterprise agreement must be better off than under the award. So such a test is really unworkable for business that might have tens of thousands of employees, like McDonald's. If one employee says they're worse off or claims they're worse off, that scuttles the whole deal. And finally, enterprise agreements in fast food and retail industries typically provide more generous wage increases than those reflected in awards. For example, McDonald's enterprise agreements have delivered real wage increases to employees of between 22 and 30% between 2012 and 2016, 22 and 30% wage increases between 2012 and 2016, while the minimum rates in the relevant award have increased by about 11% over the same period. In addition, many businesses in fast food and retail pay higher rates of pay than the minimum rates set out in the enterprise agreements. So this is what we've got. We've got a situation where there are sensationalist, factless claims being made, being thrown around, workers all over the place being worse off. We all remember the worker standing behind Bill Shorten on day one after this decision, how his wages were going to be slashed. It turned out he wasn't even impacted at all, wasn't relevant to it, but he was put up as a stooge basically to say the sky is falling. He's not falling. So keep this in mind. This was a decision made by an independent umpire based on fact and on law. An independent umpire. The decision was made under the Labor Party's Fair Work Act. Nothing has changed over the past 4 years to alter that. It's the Labor Party's Fair Work Act that we made the arguments under, and we were fortunate enough to win. We run a lot of cases. I have people in the Commission every day, tens of people in the Commission every day. Guess what? We don't win every one. Far from it. But sometimes we do win when we win, and when we win, it's because our arguments around fact and law have won out. That's what this is about. Now, just remember, as I came down in the elevator from that hearing, I was pleasantly surprised by the outcome. I came down in the lift with a union official, a very senior union official. And they said to me, "This is a great decision." What does that mean? And they said, "This is a great decision because it gives us something to campaign on and something to go to town on you guys about." Not about the facts, not about the law, not about whether it was right or wrong according to how the Commission is set up, because it created a political excuse for a campaign. I think tonight we've outlaid the case. This is a decision that is relevant to a couple of sectors of the economy, has very little, if no wider, relevance or ramifications. It's been made because these sectors are deemed to be different. And I'll just finish with this anecdote. A friend of mine runs a hotel, and she says that on Sundays she pays the dishwasher about 130% more than she pays the head chef, who works on a contract. Does that seem fair or right to you? I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's an enormous privilege to work at a university because you get to meet opinion leaders and people you'd otherwise only see on the 7:30 report or hear with John Fain in the morning. But the genuine joy is the talented students with whom we work. So it's absolutely fitting that we finished today with one of our best debaters, Amy Gilbertson. Amy is a fourth-year arts law student at Monash. She's debated in the semi-finals of both the Australasian Debating Championships and the Australasian Women's Debating Championships. She's been on the Monash Association of Debating's executive and stepped up and led and convened the Women's Championships last year. Amy with the final word.
It's been a fairly interesting position from the opposition team in this debate tonight, where they have both said that they've tried to water down the effect that this decision will have on those employees and said that it will be rolled out over 4 years, that each year they will only take a little decrease and that it will affect very few people in very, very specific sectors. But they've also tried to say that this new policy and this decision by the Fair Work Commission will also save businesses from running, and this will actually be the reason that they'll be able to stay alive. That feels like an incongruent position to sit in this debate, and what is actually more likely to be the case is, whilst this decision may not have that much effect on businesses, because businesses have large outputs and have large profits, and these penalty rates on Sundays and on public holidays don't actually change their business functions at all. It will affect the lives of those people in a large way because they're on minimum wage, because this is actually quite a substantial portion of their wage, and this is something that actually will affect their lives in a real way. And we think that's probably more the position in tonight's debate. So we believe there was 3 questions in tonight's debate. Firstly, like the principal justification for penalty rates. Secondly, how this affects employees. And thirdly, how this affects business owners. So firstly, onto the principal justification for penalty rates. We heard from the opposition team that this is a penalty on labour, that this is like a penalty, and this is saying that we are trying to stop labour from working in those ways. What we actually think this is a reflection of our society's value on a certain amount of time, on taking that time off. We don't think you're trying to penalise labour. We're trying to say that certain times, like weekends and public holidays, are a time that we do not want people to work, or we think that if they should work, that time is more valuable than any other day of the week. We think that whilst religion maybe doesn't have the prevalence that it used to, we still think that historically and culturally that this is seen as a rest day, that most people on Sundays, you have that idyllic breakfast in bed and reading the paper in bed, or your computer online, because times are changing as well, but you still have that same difference in how things work. Mothers and Father's Day don't fall on Sundays, because it seems that is a collective time in which your family is together, that everyone is at home, and therefore if that is a time that we say that is a special time that you should be at home, you should pay people more who choose to work on those things. We heard from the opposition team that people play sport more often on these days, which means working instead of that time is an opportunity cost that you would not otherwise have. And we think that is why this time should necessarily be charged more if you were going to work it, particularly for those on minimum wage who have less bargaining power in these instances. But we also think that even if it's not seen as a day of rest, even if this isn't a particularly valuable time, that we think it comes as it is valuable and it has an extra value than Monday to Friday, because it's a collective time off. Because most people will work Monday to Friday. Most people will go to uni or school or do an apprenticeship from Monday to Friday. So this is a time where you get to collectively be together, to see your friends, to hang out with your family. And we think that is important in and of itself, and we should try. And even if it's not Sunday in particular is like special inherently, we have decided as a society that weekends have a special value, and that therefore anyone who has to work on those days should be remunerated in that sense. We think that like in terms of, for example, like I have worked in retail and I got paid a lot higher on Sundays, and that made missing social events or missing family events, like whilst that was sad, that was something that I chose to do, whereas my sister, whose primary form of work is babysitting, which is an unregulated market, and she doesn't get penalty rates, will often choose not to work on weekends because then she has to miss social occasions because the money isn't worth it. And we think this is where you see that value reflected in the market, because that is a collective time off. Therefore, it is something. But even if it's not, we're not talking about students. If you are, for example, a working mother, this is your time that you get to see that you might get to see your children, or that you have to look after your children, and you might have to pay a babysitter if you have to work on weekends. And we think this is really important as to why you have penalty rates. We also think that we were told by the opposition team that young people choose to, and they have a preference to work weekends. We think sometimes often young people are forced to work weekends. This is something that they not necessarily choose, but because they have university Monday to Friday, or because they have school, that weekends and nights are the only times that they can. But also because the older people within their workforce have children or have families, so can't work weekends, so young people are often forced to do that. You often see young people working over Christmas or public holidays because people with families can't afford to. So we don't think it's true necessarily that young people choose to, but more that they're forced to, and we should have penalty rates to reflect that. So that is the principal justification for penalty rates. So how does this affect employees? So we think that this money is worth a lot more to employees than it ever will be to business owners. We think that because of the fact that employees earn a lot less, that their bargaining power is a lot less, that this money that is, from what I read, was between $2,000 to $6,000 for most people who work on penalty rates. I don't know the figures, but this is what I read online. It'll be somewhere between that. That is quite substantial to the people who are working this time, because what this is like if you're working minimum wage, which is between $30,000 and $40,000 a year, that is quite a substantial part of your pay, as opposed to someone who owns that business and that turnover doesn't affect them in the same way. We think that is really important that these low-income earners are protected. But we also think it's important in terms of their financial planning and their ability to do that. So whilst this will be rolled out over 4 years, a lot of people enter into debt relationships that last much longer than that, be it mortgages, be it lease agreements, be it car payments or credit card debt. These decisions will stay with you for much longer. So it doesn't matter if this is rolled out over 4 years, that can affect your decision, your ability to plan in the next couple of years. But also if you take on those debts later on and these penalty rates have been cut, you now have less ability to meet those. So we think this means it leads to higher increases of debt in society, particularly for those people who are worse off, who are worse placed to handle those kind of debts because they earn the lowest. We also think that in terms of people supporting themselves is made much harder. We heard that minimum wage increases will fix that. Firstly, we think that minimum wage, if you're going to increase minimum wage as a substitute for cutting penalty rates, that seems a little bit bizarre. But secondly, that minimum wage increase to keep minimum wage above inflation, they're not there to affect penalty rates, and because there's a principal justification for penalty rates in the sense that that time is seen as more important than time during the week, we think that therefore this should be protected as well, and that minimum wages shouldn't be used to fix that. But we also think, we're told that it's mainly students who work within these industries, so don't need to support themselves. We heard that fast food is mainly school students. Firstly, a lot of students still need to support themselves. Like a lot of people in here will live out of home, will need to make rent, will need to feed themselves and do all of that, and sometimes youth allowance isn't enough, or you can't get access to youth allowance for whatever reason. But we also think, I've worked in retail, a lot of people in that industry aren't just students. They are people who are supporting themselves, they're young mothers, or they're young families who are trying to make ends meet, and we don't think that is necessarily true. We were told that this brings people in who are outside the labour market. We think that considering the actual decrease in how this works, because it's only removing it from 200% or double time to time and a half, to 175% for retail, and I think it's reducing it from 150 to 100. I'm not quite sure what the reduction is with. What's the other one? Hospitality. But because these reductions are not as reducing it by half, it's very unlikely that it will bring people into the labour market. We also were told that these cuts will won't move into other industries. This was an interesting argument that they said these were specific to hospitality and retail, when their arguments about improving small businesses and their arguments about keeping these businesses alive were applicable to lots of other industries. It was unclear why they thought these industries were specific and why these cuts in penalty rates would only apply to these types of industries. So finally, on how does this affect business owners? We were told that there were 4 likely situations that would improve business owners, that they either currently choose not to trade, they either proprietors have to work themselves, they are understaffed, or they trade at a loss or pass on prices to consumers. We firstly say that those who choose not to trade or where proprietors work themselves are unlikely to be affected by this policy because the decrease doesn't allow them to justify the operating cost of opening their entire businesses because they still have to pay penalty rates to that person who works on a Sunday. So you're unlikely to open your entire business based on this decrease. You're also unlikely to stop working yourself based on this decrease, so it's unlikely to affect those situations, particularly for those where it came to passing those reductions onto consumers. We were told that we are charged higher prices on the basis of penalty rates. This was unlikely because of the decreases are probably too small to pass on to a lot of consumers, so it's unlikely to actually have any real effect on consumer prices. Also, consumers don't really expect to pay more on Sundays, so there isn't that expectation in society, so business owners can get away with doing this. But thirdly, the submissions that were made by business owners to the Fair Work Commissions all said they would not reduce prices based on this penalty rate cut, so we don't think that that stands up there. As opposed to those industries being understaffed and trading at a loss, whilst these may affect these industries as to these businesses as to improve themselves a little bit, we think the effects to these workers is much greater. So because we think that there's a principal justification behind penalty rates, because that time is more important and collective time off is important, and because we think that this cut to minimum wage workers is going to affect their lives, we are so proud to oppose.
Very well done. We can now open the floor to questions. You can question any of the speakers. Yes, please.
Yeah, I've got a question for the family team. Surprise, I work in retail, as a casual worker, and by coincidence I'm skipping both church and a huge family gathering this Sunday to work. But that wasn't the question. Just context. My question is that I actually work for JB Hi-Fi, and they're a company that's carefully considered the Fair Work Commission's decision and decided to not pass on those cuts to people like me. Obviously, I'm quite happy with that. But I'm just wondering how that gels with, I think you guys are very specific to say that this is retail and hospitality. It was actually on those decisions that JB Hi-Fi decided not to pass it on, given that it was really important for a retailer to have that customer front that was, I guess, happy with the job.
Every business is different. Every business has different circumstances. Every business has different issues that they have to deal with. A cafe is different to a JB Hi-Fi. They have different issues. A cafe could have, you'll have all read about it, you're paying it, your parents paying it, massive increases in energy costs, electricity costs. So they're different to JB Hi-Fi in different ways. So each business is different. That's the beauty of this decision, is that it's not, and I think I tried to make the case that most businesses don't operate under the award anyhow, which is impacts. They have other arrangements, like bargaining arrangements, which you may all have with JB Hi-Fi. But that's the beauty of this decision, that businesses don't have to take it up. But they can, if their circumstances warrant it, to allow it. It's not compulsory. We never argue that it was just to give businesses the opportunity, should their circumstances dictate, should they build their market, compare it to the employment market, compare it to the customer market, compare it to their cost base, compare it to reduce their costs, basically describe all the way through in a modest way.
Thank you. We might just take the one answer so we give multiple questions. There was another hand up earlier. Yes, sorry, and then I'll come to you. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I work for a small independent pharmacy, and sometimes work some days. And from the first July, this incremental wage has been. And contrary to what a lot of newspapers say, they've actually reduced our hours rather than increasing them. Now we can keep on throwing anecdotes at each other, making anecdotes. the data shows that the majority of employment growth in Australia comes from large businesses, and these large businesses are less likely, or unlikely rather, to reinvest these additional profits in employment growth. So how can you then justify all the this massive growth that you're starting to
I think you just make the point every business is individual. You've got one, who knows why they've cut your hours on a Sunday. They certainly haven't cut it because the penalty rates have increased, but because penalty rates are salient to them. You must be able to sum up the purpose driving it. What we do know about pharmacies, and pharmacies are one of my members in the case, is a lot of pharmacies don't open Sundays, and a lot of pharmacies are looking at opening Sundays, potentially based on the penalty rate changes. So we talk at one level about going out, having a burger, having a beer, having a coffee, that's cool. There are some parts of this city where it's really difficult to get a prescription filled without travelling a fair way. That's a pretty significant thing in the community that people are looking at. In terms of what's going to happen across the economy, whether more jobs will be created, these are moderate changes. They're not dramatic. You're not suddenly going to turn on an absolute tap, but you've got a number of individual business decisions about opening, about staffing, and this is going to make a difference to them. But the biggest point I want to come back to is, don't take my word for it. Don't take the limited set of anecdotes we've given you today. The Commission sat for 39 days, received thousands of submissions, analysed voluminous evidence, the best case we could put, and the best case they could put, and the independent umpire reached a set of conclusions, and they are in essence, more jobs will be created, more hours will be offered to the underemployed, and more services will be available to communities. That's the evidence, that's the decision of the independent decision maker, and that's what our best mechanism as a society has said is going to happen.
Thank you. Next question.
My question is also for the
We have the most questions to answer.
the audience, I guess. If your business model cannot support the basic income of your employers in addition to operation costs, is that not an indictment on your business plan rather than a policy that supports particularly vulnerable stakeholders?
Well, it's not the basic income. It's a penalty rate applied to the basic income. So it's an additional rate.
Bring me one.
Just in addition, in answer to that, you've heard from the negative side that this was not used to fund holidays or large amounts of disposable income. This is about people who live paycheck to paycheck. So how does that work?
I look like an editor.
That's right, no?
Sort of typical.
It's all hospitality. Thank you very much. I should actually be getting extra money because it's after 7. The idea is not that people's business models are so marginal necessarily that these rates are absolutely driving more business. I gave you an example of something where that is the case. But other things people are telling us, it's a variety of behaviours. Understaffing, proprietor labour substituting for other people, short opening. So the pharmacy example, a lot of pharmacies are open very briefly. Their customers would come more, but they can't afford it. They don't make enough on the whole shift to do so. So look, it's a complex range of things, but a lot of businesses, just to go to your example, have they got a core business model? A lot of businesses that operate in big shopping centres have to open on Sundays and have to open on public holidays, and they do so at a loss.
At one point, just so you're aware, according to the ATO, the tax office, 80% of Australian businesses either run at a loss or a very minimal profit. Not having millions of dollars churn through their cash registers. Not every business is BHP. In fact, there's only one BHP. The majority of businesses in Australia are small businesses, family run or small businesses employing 10 people or less.
Question.
So I have a question for the negative team.
Great.
So I found this debate really interesting and hearing the sort of arguments either side. But I guess if we accept negative team that you guys were right and this was a bad decision, what's the point of critiquing it? Because it has been made by an individual, like by an independent commission. So then my question is, do you critique it just because you're saying the Fair Work Commission got it wrong and we want to have our arguments out there and this was an outlier decision that was wrong? Or do you think that these sorts of issues should be adjudicated in another way? Do you think that there should be a change in the makeup of the Fair Work Commission? Do you think that they should be legislated? I just don't really understand the sort of outcome of the critique, given that it's being made by an independent tribunal, and what they kind of want to do from there.
Sure, a couple of things. The independent tribunal in this case operates within a set of policy parameters provided by government and Parliament and a set of laws. And everything that was said opposite is true. The current Workplace Relations Act was put in place by the previous Labor government, and by a series of accidents, largely the members who dealt with this were appointed. I think that is completely irrelevant to appoint those members. I trust their integrity. Perhaps a couple of exceptions, people on different sides. Sorry, I don't mean those two members, but generally I think the appointments of the Commission haven't been overly political. They're decent people. They do their job. I guess my point is, as a parliamentarian, I do not accept, and none of us should accept, we live in a democracy, not a technocracy, right? And that's important. We don't have to blindly accept the outcomes of tribunals. If we believe that they are either bad for society or bad for the economy, as the case we put forward, and I particularly point to the precedent issue. Those factors that I outlined from the decision, and they apply across dozens of other industries. If we believe that that is a wrong decision, it is not just our right, it is our responsibility to speak up and say, hey, I think that's wrong. We've never intended that you could use the system in the way it's being used to put a wage cut across the board. We just didn't anticipate that. Sure, we might have got the laws wrong. We should correct that, and that is our responsibility. I'd also point out, if we're being political for a moment, I've worked for both sides of politics. I've worked for Liberal governments, I've worked for Labor governments, I've been a public servant. We're not always right, we're not always wrong. But I would point out the complete hypocrisy of the Prime Minister standing up there and yelling at us. It kind of went ranty, he does that sometimes. Yelling at us about how we've got to accept the umpire's decision, when his government didn't like the decision of the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, which said, hey, it's probably not a good idea to drive for 1,000 hours, it's kind of not good for road safety, we should have a bunch of minimum standards and wages. So they legislated to abolish the entire tribunal. So we like that independent abolish shoot. So, they're generally governments.
You can abolish the Fair Work Commission if you like.
We've actually not suggested that. With respect, I think that's a smart-ass response to the point. You can look at the decision and go, we like it or we don't, but we're not shooting the tribunal. We've had an independent tribunal since 1904, but at times over the 107 years, governments go, we don't like that decision, we're intervening. We change the policy programs, that's our job, there you go. So.
Thank you. We're going to have one last question.
Can I just have a little rebuttal?
That's fair, it was a long response.
On the road safety remuneration tribunal, completely not analogous at all. Different tribunals set up for a different purpose entirely, and it's short term, and I can give you a long argument about why it was set up and what its purpose was. Fair Work Commission and its antecedents have been around for well over 100 years. They used to centralise wage fixing in Australia. It would be done by the Commission. Now it's done at enterprise level. The Commission's role is to make adjudications based on the evidence put before it. So if my concern with what Julian's proposition is that if we politicise the Fair Work Commission, which is essentially what Julian is suggesting we do, Labor gets in next time, makes some decisions it thinks is fair, a coalition gets in, and then next it makes some decisions it thinks are fair. It completely politicises wage fixing. And the important things in your life, they swing on a dime at an election result rather than having an independent tribunal, which is made up of people from all sides of politics and all sides of history, unions, employers, and the like. It's just, as Julian said, it's just a matter of happenstance that it was by Labor or one of these two. That's not relevant. Well, not overwhelming in this is the fact. But you don't want to go around politicising a tribunal like this, or else it loses all purpose, and then sort of one step away from industrial relations out of it.
Thank you. Yeah, can I?
Now you're getting the debate.
So I do think that there are the problem with the Fair Work Commission decision, you can't see it in abstract, and you can't see it as the abstract application of law dealing just with this specific industry and this specific group of workers. It has to be seen in the overall context where inequality in Australia is at the highest. We've got 40% of the workforce in insecure work, so that means they don't have rights to paid annual leave, paid sick leave, paid carers leave to look after their family. And the decision that then attacks work on Sundays needs to be seen in this overall context. And it's in that broader context that we're able to say, well, whether the decision comes from politicians, whether the decision comes from a legislative body like the Fair Work Commission, whether it comes through an appeal from the federal court, these laws are not working for Australian people, and we need to fight them.
Thank you, Susie. One last question and a very short response, because I know there's people who have to get away, so please.
If we as an Australian society so heavily value getting a coffee at whatever time we want on a Sunday, and it's primarily, and if we accept that it's primarily small businesses that suffer having to pay penalty rates, why don't we simply alleviate those costs through something like small business grants and tax cuts, so that the cost isn't borne only by the minimum wage workers who live there, who work there, and that question's open to anyone who wants to answer.
So an answer, one from each side?
There's a myriad of things that governments of both sides should be challenged to do to make it easier to run a small business in our country. Small business tax cuts are an important part of that, as is red tape alleviation, as is, to an extent, positive support from government. But what we'd actually like in small business is to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and more people to be able to translate good ideas into businesses in this country more easily. So, absolutely. But the labour costs in those businesses, once you get beyond yourself, your partner, your family in a small business, you want to grow, you employ people. And the cost we put on job creation, on job offering, is important. It's the balance. The other side's talked about balance. We've talked about balance in different ways. You need to set the cost of creating jobs, the cost of creating jobs on days where customers want to work with small businesses to buy what they sell. You need to set those in a way that both provides fairness and that provides job opportunities. And just to go to some points that have been made opposite in a general way, the Commission didn't just look at the impact on businesses. And it didn't just look at the thing we're talking to about. It balanced, and under the rules that Labor set up, it balanced the needs of the community, employment, unemployment, and the business factors we're talking about. It had a really big, detailed look. It thought about fairness, it thought about casual workers, it thought about a whole lot of things, and it reached a balanced decision, and it reached a decision which was more moderate than we wanted. It wasn't, we didn't get our full claim, but it reached a decision which, whilst not a huge reduction, will make a difference.
Can I do a really short response? Hands up who can find a coffee on Sunday in Melbourne. I think we can find a coffee on Sunday in Melbourne.
But you wait in the queue. You have dirty table. Within too many places. We see chronic understaffing. More people could be able to work.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you to vote. What I'm going to ask you to say is whether, given what you thought before you came in, who's changed their mind? Who's changed their mind on the basis of the argument? Well done. Well done. Okay. So, you've been preaching to conversion, or I think it's been a wonderful night. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank the organisers, and I thank the audience for contributing so actively in this very interesting discussion.
Yeah, thanks for coming here.
Yes, and I remind you all.
It's never been the same since they got rid of the chickens.
I can hear this when I went to Melbourne.
Yeah. My form of rebellion against my mother to come to Monash.
So just quickly before you all leave, I guess I just want to second what Susan said about thanking everyone everyone for coming here tonight, thanking all of our wonderful speakers. I know you've taken time out of your busy lives and your busy days to come here tonight, and for all of our debaters and everyone else from our Monash community for coming out here. We're so grateful. We have a couple of just little gifts to hand out to everyone tonight, just to kind of little tokens of our gratitude, because this is an annual event we run every year, and we're so proud to have made it happen again this year, and we think it was a very interesting debate, and whether we changed our minds or not, I'm sure we all learnt some new things, and you know, it's good always to hear about new perspectives. I mean, that's why we all do debating. We love hearing about different sides. So again, just a little thank you from us here tonight for everyone. Our most important thank you has to go to Susan, our Deputy Vice Chancellor, for coming out here to moderate the event. We are so grateful to have Vice Chancellor support every year. It means so much to us.